She stopped a Mafia king from signing his own death warrant. 1 second before Dominic Rossi's pen touched the $4.2 billion contract, a soaking wet accountant burst into the boardroom screaming, "Don't sign it." 20 armed men aimed their guns at her chest, but what she held in that red folder was more dangerous than bullets. It exposed a trap that could destroy his empire, send him to prison forever, and start Mafia or war overnight. Let us open this case file together. Picture a man who embodies the absolute peak of megalomaniacal narcissism, holding a pen above a document worth $4.2 billion. This was the moment Dominic Rossi about to wash his blood-stained legacy clean. The boardroom was tension, but then the door shattered that silence, blown open by a breathless, terrified accountant gripping a red folder. She told him not to sign. In my years studying apex predators in maximum security, I have rarely seen what Dominic did next. It paralyzed a room of hardened killers, and it teaches us a vital lesson. The greatest weapon a psychopath possesses is pure, calculated unpredictability. We must first analyze the subject, Penelope Hayes. From a clinical perspective, Penelope had adapted to profound invisibility as a psychological survival mechanism. In the razor-thin, ruthless environment of high-end corporate finance, her physical presence made her entirely irrelevant to the senior partners. They completely excluded her from client dinners and company photographs, feeding her the grueling psychological torture of endless raw data. But this is where the human mind fascinates me. Isolation breeds hypervigilances. Because no one ever looked at Penelope, no one realized how deeply she was looking at them. It is a simple truth. Those society forces into the shadows are often the only ones who can see clearly in the dark. Penelope did not just process numbers. She exhibited a profound cognitive empathy for data, tracing the pathology of money through offshore holdings and dummy corporations, like a bloodhound on a fresh scent. It Tuesday night, approaching midnight, the rain severely blurring the neon lights outside her isolated cubicle. While the rest of her floor sat in absolute darkness, she was executing a final sweep of the subletters for a $4.2 billion acquisition by Aegis Capital. Aegis was a corporate titan, but behind that mask lay a deeply entrenched criminal organization. Her obsessive compulsions toward accuracy were about to trigger a psychological collision with the dangerous. To understand the clinical environment of Wall Street, Yogi, you must carefully listen to the whispers. Aegis Capital was simply the sanitized, socially acceptable mask for the Rossi syndicate. Dominic Rossi, a man who inherited his father's psychopathic empire at 30, had spent 5 years meticulously laundering his identity. This Meridian Logistics deal was the ultimate narcissistic supply, his unquestionable crown jewel. Owning those global shipping lanes meant total immunity from federal prosecution. He would achieve the megalomaniac's dream of true untouchability. Exhausted, Penelope rubbed her eyes, adjusted her glasses, and clicked through a sequence of holding accounts. She was stepping directly into the cage of an apex predator. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and Penelope was high-calibrated to detect cognitive dissonance. It began as a microscopic anomaly in a depreciation schedule for cargo freighters operating out of Genoa. A lesser mind would have rationalized the error. Instead, her hypervigilance immediately engaged. She cross-referenced the manifests with Port Authority tax filings, muttering to the empty room that these ships were not carrying textiles. Bypassing the sterilized psychological barriers her boss had erected, she penetrated the raw, unformatted data. Over the next 3 hours, her central nervous system flooded with cortisol. The clinical truth she uncovered would have paralyzed a veteran homicide detective. Meridian Logistics was not a functional entity. It was a financial corpse artificially animated by billions in hidden liabilities. But the pathology went far deeper than simple corporate fraud. This debt was controlled entirely by the Moretti family, the Rossi Syndicate's most violently sadistic rivals in Chicago. It was a breathtaking example of Machiavellian engineering. If Dominic Rossi signed that contract, he would immediately assume $2 billion in cartel debt and direct links to federal racketeering violations. The moment the transaction concluded, the trap would snap shut. Rossi would rot in a supermaximum scimitar facility while his empire was devoured. Penelope stared in absolute horror at the lethal evidence she printed. Look closely at this precise moment of intervention. Penelope clutched 30 pages of absolute catastrophic proof, her autonomic nervous systems pushed to the sheer brink of panic. She was merely an auditor who preferred baking and quiet documentaries, utterly unprepared for the psychological warfare of organized crime. Yet at 8 a.m, she confronted her superior, Roland Sterling. It's a creature entirely by a hollow shell reeking of expensive gin and profound antisocial tendencies. She demanded he halt the signing, slapping the folder onto his desk. Roland did not even look at the evidence. He simply offered her a micro-expression of utter clinical disdain, dismissing her existence entirely. Roland was completely blind to the impending violence, fixated solely on his $50 million commission. When a mind is corrupted by that level of greed, it loses all self-preservation instincts. Penelope desperately tried to penetrate his cognitive distortion. She explained the Genoa routing numbers, outlining how this was a lethal Trojan horse. She made it explicitly clear that when the megalomaniacal Dominic Rossi discovered their catastrophic negligence, he would violently end their lives. Roland simply stood, buttoning his jacket, his voice dropping to sociopathic deadpan. He reminded her she was a junior analyst, entirely incapable of understanding the high-stakes risk tolerance of billionaires playing a jurisdiction game. Roland delivered his final psychological blow, ordering her to delete her findings and remain silent or face immediate termination. He brushed past her, asserting physical dominance through total dismissal. Penelope stood frozen, caught in the paralyzing grip of a trauma-induced response. She faced a critical behavioral crossroad. She could retreat into her lifelong invisibility and wait for inevitable slaughter, or she could be irrational, highly dangerous from her baseline personality. She grabbed the folder. We learn here that true morality often requires absolute reckless defiance. Her desperate sprint to the 50th floor was a study in pure adrenaline, completely overriding her mortal terror. The architectural psychology of the Aegis Tower was designed explicitly to crush the human spirit, a minimalist monument to systemic intimidation. At the head of a massive black marble table sat Dominic Rossi. In my clinical evaluations of cartel leaders, they rarely look like the cinematic monsters we expect. Dominic was striking, with sharp aristocratic features and eyes resembling polished obsidian. He was wrapped in a bespoke charcoal suit that projected immense, unassailable wealth. Yet, it was not his physical symmetry that dominated the room. It was the suffocating, almost tangible aura of a true megalomaniac. He sat completely motionless, exhibiting the lowered resting heart rate of a predator patiently preparing to strike. Stationed slightly behind him was his underboss, Leo Cavallo, From a behavioral standpoint, Leo was the blunt instrument to Dominic's scalpel, marked by a thick scar through his eyebrow that served as the visual to anyone forgetting their violent origins. Across the oppressive expanse of marble sat Richard Croft, the chief executive of Meridian, flanked by actively perspiring attorneys. Croft attempted to project executive dominance, but his basal anxiety entirely betrayed him. A slight in his hands revealed his internal terror. He announced the funds were secured in escrow, his pitch betraying severe vocal tension. He desperately promised the introduction would conclude perfectly by the end of the fiscal quarter. Let me pull you directly into the mind of a king here. Dominic subject Croft to an unblinking, predatory stare. A man of his deep psychopathology spends a lifetime dissecting the micro-expressions of fear, deception, and human desperation in others. Something in Croft's postural sway triggered Dominic's acute paranoia. The financial concessions offered during the final week of negotiations defied all logical business practices. Dominic's voice was a low, resonant baritone naturally designed to induce submissive behavior. Croft rushed to validate him, citing the spotless audit from Sterling and Price. Leo leaned down, breaking the tension, his while whispering in Sicilian. He confessed his deep psychological unease about the arrangement. Maintaining a mask of absolute emotional detachment, Dominic replied in the exact same dialect. He was rationalizing his profound ambition. They required these legitimate ports, fearing the criminal commission would soon force them into the fentanyl trade. He possessed a twisted moral superiority, vowing not to let his father's violent psychopathy infect another generation. It is a common delusion among cartel leaders, believing they can magically sanitize trauma with legitimate wealth. As he withdrew his pen, an entirely different trauma response was unfolding 50 floors below. Penelope was fighting a desperate behavioral battle against building security. Lungs burning, she bypassed the desk by flashing her Platinum Tier Auditor badge. Opened the file on subject Penelope Hayes. Today, you and I are going to examine a textbook of psychological subjugation. We begin in an executive elevator, ascending 50 floors. The subject exhibits classic signs of hyperarousal, gasping for air, leaning against the glass, her physical state disheveled. She is an exhausted accountant, carrying a red folder like a makeshift shield. She mutters to herself about death and health insurance, a rationalization mechanism to cope with extreme fear. She is about to enter the domain of a highly dangerous individual, yet her immediate concern is her corporate standing. This tells us her baseline trauma response is already skewed. The doors open to reveal 2 armed guards. The prey has officially arrived at the predator's door. The guards outside the boardroom act as the physical extension of the kingpin's absolute control. They square their shoulders, their hands hovering near concealed weapons, projecting an unspoken but lethal threat. The subject, Penelope, attempts to bypass them, her breathing erratic. She demands to see Dominic Rossi, citing an emergency regarding the Meridian acquisition. Notice her behavior here. Her voice rises in panic, a clear indicator of a nervous system flooding with cortisol. The guards simply cross their woman, amused by this frazzled woman who clearly does not belong in their high-stakes ecosystem. They order her to leave. Penelope is operating under the delusion that her corporate urgency somehow outweighs their lethal, cold reality. She stares at the heavy oak doors, calculating the risk. If Rossi signs that paper, he falls into a federal trap. The guards issue a final warning, and the larger one seizes her arm. His grip is designed to immediate compliance through pain, but Here is a simple life lesson. Fear can either paralyze you entirely or push you to do the absolute unthinkable. Penelope has spent her life being marginalized and physically moved aside by stronger forces. In this fraction of a second, her fight or flight response devolves whole to violence. Fueled by a massive spike of adrenaline, she swings the hard-backed red folder directly into the guard's face. The cartilage in his nose shatters with a loud crack. The psychological dam has broken. The prey is finally fighting back. Before the second guard can draw his firearm, she throws her entire body weight forward, lunging past him to breach the mahogany doors. They slam open with the concussive force of a gunshot. The atmosphere instantly freezes. Now we observe the megalomaniacal narcissist Dominic Ross. His pen hovers exactly 1 millimeter above the signature line. He does not flinch. His autonomic nervous system is entirely suppressed, a hallmark of deep psychopathy. He slowly raises his dark eyes. Penelope stands in the doorway, soaked chest violently heaving, clutching a dented red folder. Every subordinate in the room stares at her, but Dominic merely observes. He is analyzing this sudden, chaotic variable introduced into his perfectly controlled environment. Richard Croft, the rival executive, loses all color in his face. Penelope screams at Dominic not to sign the $4.2 billion deal. The room immediately erupts into controlled tactical chaos. 4 armed security personnel draw suppressed handguns in less than a second, aiming directly at her chest. Behind her, the bruised guards grab her shoulders, ready to snap her neck. A subordinate named Leo asks for the order to execute. You and I must look at Penelope's mental state here. She squeezes her eyes shut, fully expecting a bullet. She has delivered the warning, and she accepts her own termination as the cost. This absolute surrender to the moment is the exact vulnerability a predator like Dominic requires to begin his long-term manipulation. She waits for the end, convinced she will bleed out on a very expensive carpet. But then a voice cuts through the tension. It is not a shout or a roar. It is quiet, yet it carries the terrifying, absolute authority of a man who dictates life and death. Dominic places his pen on the marble table. The sharp click echoes like a gavel in the silent room. He stands to his full height of 6 feet 3 inches, ignoring the guards and the executives. He is entirely on Penelope. He softly commands them to step back. The guards release her instantly, retreating as though she were suddenly radioactive. The weapons are lowered. Croft begins to stammer, sweating profusely, calling the woman deranged, desperately trying to regain control of a room he has already lost. Dominic tells Croft to shut up, his voice barely above a whisper. He does not even look at the panicked CEO. His dark obsidian eyes are locked firmly on Penelope, clinically scanning her from her ruined shoes to her trembling hands. He circles the massive marble table with the deliberate but terrifying grace of an apex predator. As he closes the distance, she becomes acutely aware of his overwhelming physical presence. He stops barely 2 feet away, exuding a scent of bergamot, rain, and cold danger. He asks for her identity, his voice a smooth, low rumble. Penelope swallows her terror and states her name, Nam, identifying herself as a forensic auditor for Sterling and Price. Dominic tilts his head slightly, gathering the preliminary data for his psychological trap. Dominic notes that Roland Sterling just assured him the acquisition was flawless 10 minutes ago. Here, Penelope makes a critical, impulsive error. Driven by sheer adrenal fatigue, she insults her own boss, calling him an incompetent fraud who only reads the cover page of a spreadsheet. A heavy, dangerous silence blankets the room. Insulting a Mafia kingpin's financial advisor to his face is practically a death wish. Leo, the enforcer, tenses for violence. But then we see a fascinating psychological pivot. Dominic Rossi smiles. It is a small, lethal curvature of the lips, fundamentally altering his imposing face. He asks if her assessment of Sterling is true. Penelope, finally finding a scrap of solid ground in her analytical mind, confirms it without hesitation. Her fear remains high, but the objective truth of the numbers provides a psychological anchor. She shoves the dented red folder against his chest. Dominic accepts it calmly from her trembling hands. She instructs him to examine page 12, detailing the depreciation schedules for the Genoa freighters, and page 14, showing the offshore debt routing. For 30 agonizing seconds, the only sound is rain lashing against the glass windows. Penelope watches his micro-expressions. She witnesses the exact fraction of a second his brilliant, ruthless brain connects the fabricated data. She sees the dawning realization of a trap. She sees the sting of betrayal. And then she sees the sudden, chilling illness of extreme violence wash over his sharp features. A shadow so dark and cold passes over his eyes that Penelope instinctively steps backward. The narcissist's ego has been threatened, triggering an immediate, terrifying shift in the room's dynamic. Dominic calmly closes the folder and turns back to the table. Richard Croft is practically vibrating with fear, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. Dominic speaks to his enforcer, Leo, his voice utterly devoid of human emotion. He orders the doors locked. The heavy metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place sounds exactly like a death knell. The rival lawyers panic and try to stand, but the security guards violently force them back down into their seats. Dominic slowly walks back to his chair, completely in command of the rising, palpable terror. He subbed the $4.2 billion contract and looks at Croft, who is now openly hyperventilating. Dominic soft confronts him about $2 billion in cartel debt, routed through a rival crime family designed as a perfectly tied bow for a federal prosecutor. Croft begins to shriek, desperately claiming ignorance and accusing Penelope of fabricating the documents. Watch Dominic's response here. He does not yell. He methodically tears the massive stack of legal contracts in half, and then in half again, letting the ruined paper flutter down onto the black marble table. Without breaking eye contact with the weeping executive, Dominic calmly orders his men to take Croft and Des and his legal team down to the soundproof basement for processing. Dominic promises a very long, detailed interrogation to uncover exactly who orchestrated this betrayal. Croft screams for mercy as massive men drag him forcefully from his chair, completely ignoring his frantic, flailing limbs. In mere seconds, the screaming executive and his lawyers are hauled away through a concealed side door. Suddenly, the boardroom is empty except for Dominic, 2 guards by the door, and Penelope. Her adrenaline finally crashes, leaving her knees weak. She realizes she has just initiated a Mafia torture session and saved a criminal kingpin. Desperate to escape this new reality, she turns toward the exit, stammering that she will just go back to her cubicle. But Dominic's voice stops her dead in her tracks, anchoring her firmly to the room. He approaches her once more, stopping only when he is inches away. She has to crane her neck to meet those dark, bottomless eyes. He reaches out, and though she flinches, his large, warm hand gently straightens her crooked glasses, his fingers lightly brushing her damp cheek. This calculated touch sends a shock of electricity through her nervous system, laying the physical groundwork for a trauma bond. He speaks softly, noting that she just saved his life, his freedom, and his empire. His gaze drops to her lips before returning to her eyes. He asks if she honestly believes he would ever let her walk away to a mundane cubicle. Penelope's mind short-circuits under the pressure. She weakly mentions she has a cat to feed, a tragic attempt to cling to her old life. That dangerous smile returns to his face. He coldly dates that her boss was willing to let him walk into a federal trap, a transgression that will be severely punished. But Penelope risked her life for a stranger. He leans in close, his warm breath against her ear triggering a profound stress response. He whispers that she belongs to him now. Let us pause here, you and I, to truly understand this moment. Penelope's brain, capable of processing massive data sets, completely shuts down. She stares up at the Kingpin, seeing the absolute, terrifying certainty in his eyes. She weakly stammers about having an apartment lease. But here is the lesson: the greatest prisons are rarely made of iron. They are built when we finally surrender our will to the predator. Let us open this case file together, you and I. We observe Penelope, a licensed accountant, attempting to enforce societal boundaries against an apex predator. She cites the modern era, claiming autonomy. Dominic responds with a classic intimidation tactic of the megalomaniacal narcissist. He uses his massive, visible presence to eclipse her environment, systematically dismantling her false sense of security. He presents the lethal reality of the $2 billion loss she caused the Moretti syndicate. Notice how he weaponizes the truth to induce shock. Her blood drains. The physiological collapse begins. In behavioral profiling, the aftermath of an adrenaline spike leaves the subject in a state of profound vulnerability. Penelope transitions from invisible civilian to high-value target. Before a cognitive dissonance can resolve, the environment shifts. An associate named Leo enters the room. Note his complete detachment as he cleans biological evidence from his gold timepiece. He operates purely on the dark triad spectrum. Leo reports that their captive broke under interrogation, confirming a severe breach within the firm. Her superior, Roland, is the infiltrator. The web tightens. The human brain desperately seeks patterns, and we see the mind of Penelope aggressively connecting the variables. Roland deliberately isolated her, exploiting her perceived meekness as a tool for corporate fraud. Beside her, Dominic exhibits the quiet, controlled rage typical of a highly functioning sociopathic leader. He issues immediate tactical commands. Then a fascinating breach protocol occurs. Driven by primal panic for her pet, Penelope makes unauthorized physical contact with her captor. It is a desperate grasp for control. Most predators would strike out, but Dominic does not retreat. Look closely at his ocular response here. The visual fixation on her hand reveals the foundational stages of obsessive acquisition. She is no longer collateral, no, she is a possession. He commands the extraction of her animal, a calculated move to secure her compliance. When subordinate questions the logistical burden of a civilian during a territorial conflict, Dominic initiates an immediate dominance display. The atmospheric tension drops drastically. In syndicate hierarchies, questioning a kingpin triggers an absolute, just a chilling assertion of supreme authority. He tolerates no dissent. The kingpin establishes an unbreakable boundary. She remains with him. As the subordinate submits, Dominic performs an act of predatory chivalry. He drapes his heavy wool coat over her shivering frame. To the untrained eye, this mimics protection, but clinically, it is an olfactory and tactile branding. She is engulfed in his scent, isolated from her previous reality. He guides her with a firm touch, an inescapable physical tether. They move into a subterranean tactical zone. A phalanx of armed operatives materializes, signaling a complete transition into the criminal underworld. The auditory contrast is striking. Her practical footwear squeaks against the concrete, a desperate sound of civilian panic amidst a military-grade extraction. They approach a fleet of armored luxury vehicles, designed to withstand ballistic assaults. Dominic physically sequesters her inside the central transport. The heavy doors seal them in a pressurized chamber of bulletproof glass and immaculate leather. It is an isolation tank. As the convoy accelerates into the torrential New York storm, Penelope remains paralyzed by acute stress response, clutching his garment as her only anchor. Let us pause and examine this psychological rupture together, you and I. Mere hours prior, her greatest stressor was an accounting anomaly. Now she is entombed with lethal enforcers. Dominic accurately diagnoses her clinical shock. He procures a deep-aged single malt spirit and enlists it almost medicinally. He directs her to consume it, a soft command masking absolute control. She obeys. The high-proof alcohol acts as a somatic disruptor, burning her throat, forcing her nervous system to reboot. In moments of severe trauma, the body accepts any remedy offered by the authority figure. The subject attempts to negotiate with her evaporating reality. She demands a timeline, clinging to the mundane details of her previous existence, her quiet routines, her lack of glamour. She asserts ownership over a life that has already ceased to exist. Dominic closes the physical distance between them. Note the magnetic gravitational pull of the dark triad personality. He brushes the damp hair from her cheek, an intimate violation of personal space. His vocal tone drops to a mesmerizing frequency as he surgically severs her ties to the past. The illusion of her safety is shattered. He explicitly reclassifies her as his property, promising care in exchange for total submission. This is the seed of the traumatic bond. They arrive at his sanctuary, a hyper-modern structure suspended above the city. Entry requires biometric verification, emphasizing absolute paranoia and control. The environment is engineered to overwhelm the senses. It is a monumental display of illicit wealth. Panoramic reinforced glass showcases the violent storm outside, while radiant heating provides artificial comfort within. He is demonstrating his power to manipulate her very atmosphere. The opulent surroundings fail to register against her profound neurological exhaustion. She is functioning on mere survival instincts. Dominic issues a sequence of commands to his security detail, securing the perimeter and preparing her enclosure. He instructs her to cleanse herself and wait. This mirrors institutional intake procedures, subtly reinforcing who commands the schedule. Too mentally depleted to exhibit defiance, Penelope adopts a state of compliant numbness. She follows the armed guard down a corridor adorned with priceless artifacts, moving like a ghost in a gilded cage. We observe her using thermal stimulation to artificially soothe her nervous system. Under the scalding water of a vast marble enclosure, she aggressively scrubs her skin. This is a common compulsive behavior following an encounter with extreme danger, a futile attempt to wash away the invisible residue of trauma. Her internal monologue finally verbalizes the sheer absurdity of her crisis. She thwarted an international crime syndicate. Emerging from the isolation of the water, she discovers a curated garment, a set of navy silk nightwear, precisely tailored to her specific bodily dimensions. The immediate procurement of luxury garments in her exact measurements at 2 a.m. demonstrates a terrifying level of logistical surveillance. By wearing the silk, she subconsciously accepts his provision. Surprisingly, it elevates her self-perception, contrasting sharply with the professional armor she used to wear. She returns to the primary living space to find him pacing in the dim light. Stripped of his corporate camouflage, he wears a fitted dark shirt. The predatory physique of a career criminal is now fully exposed. He is no longer masquerading. The monster is unmasked. As she approaches, his visual assessment of her is entirely unfiltered. The ocular consumption is heavy, projecting a dangerous, possessive hunger that has been suppressed for years.
No one has ever subjected her to such an intense gaze, and it fundamentally destabilizes her baseline composure. She attempts to deploy a defensive posture, demanding logical answers.
Dominic orchestrates their physical positioning, guiding her to a seating arrangement that mimics a clinical intake. He does not soften the psychological blow. He plainly states that a violent tactical team breached her residence. You and I must recognize the precise moment the psychological dependency solidifies. He reveals that assassins were lying in wait within her private sanctuary. He immediately neutralizes her secondary anxiety by confirming her pet is secure and actively aggravating his security chief. The relief shatters her emotional containment walls. She weeps openly, the delayed realization of her near-death experience flooding her system. Here is the vital lesson of survival conditioning. When the architect of your beauty becomes your sole source of comfort, the emotional trap snaps shut permanently. He moons her. Reviewing this initial interaction, you and I can observe the classic mechanics of trauma bonding. Dominic established physical dominance by gripping Penelope's wrists, applying just enough pressure to simulate a threat while masking it as protection. "Look at me," he demanded, forcing eye contact to ensure complete psychological submission. He assured her she was safe. She's promising extreme violence against his rivals. The Moretti is over the next 6 months. He positioned himself as the omnipotent savior. Penelope, exhibiting deep-seated feelings of worthlessness, whispered that she was merely an accountant, a nobody. But the megalomaniacal narcissist needs an exceptional reflection. He wiped her tear, countering that she was extraordinary for facing down armed killers. We see the clinical elevation of the victim's essence self-worth, a necessary phase in psychological grooming. Dominic isolated her specific intellectual value, noting she saw what 20 highly paid corporate lawyers missed.
When Penelope protested that she was not an object, using his first name to test boundaries, his reaction was raw, predatory fixation.
He labeled her an empire builder. This is a brilliant manipulation tactic. By dropping a heavy platinum card onto the glass table, he did not offer her a job. He declared her the new chief financial officer of Aegis Capital. He promised a staff of 50 and absolute autonomy, provided she eradicated the traps set by his enemies. He offered her the world, effectively building a gilded cage she would never want to leave. Look closely at Penelope Ezra's internal calculus in this moment. Staring at the platinum card, her mind contrasted the psychological abuse she endured from Roland Sterling and her invisible existence against the immediate gratification of power. The subject was being offered a throne built on blood by a lethal asocial personality. Instead of fleeing, her adaptation mechanism engaged. She announced she had conditions, her voice trembling but her chin raised in a display of sudden defiance. Dominic smiled a devastating smile, the expression of a predator watching its prey step willingly into the trap.
"Name them, Regina,"
he replied. The massive glass hearth cast dancing shadows, but the palpable heat in the room emanated entirely from his pathological obsession with her. He observed her with the dark intensity of a starved man finding his ultimate fixation.
"Name your conditions, my queen," he repeated. using an Italian endearment as a verbal tether to his world.
Penelope forced her respiratory rate to stabilize. Note the stark contrast of her reality. She sat in silk pajamas inside the guarded fortress of a syndicate boss,
Falsely believing the platinum card gave her
the upper hand.
For the first time in 28 years, she stopped shrinking. Her first condition was laid out with remarkable vocal stability,
masking her elevated heart rate. She refused to manipulate financial records, demanding her department remain legitimate. If he wanted to run illicit funds, she mandated it be kept completely isolated from her secure corporate servers. She clearly articulated her refusal to be indicted on racketeering charges. Dominic leaned back against the leather sofa, crossing his broad chest in a posture of relaxed dominance. A slow smirk indicated his clinical amusement at her illusion of control. He agreed instantly, assigning her the clean empire while he maintained the dirt. Her sanctuary condition rated an increasing hyperfocus on structural authority. She demanded the right to construct her own team, explicitly rejecting the privileged analysts currently stagnating in the finance department. She reared hungry, highly competent individuals who scrutinized the fine print. She insisted on total hiring and firing power, completely immune to his interference. His dark eyes flared with dangerous, approving amusement. She framed her demand for absolute authority over his corporate structure as a necessary survival tactic. She needed the tools to keep him out of a federal penitentiary, boldly stating their survival was mutually tethered. Dominic agreed, his voice dropping in pitch as he dismantled the physical space between them. He reached out, his thumb dragging her jawline in a calculated maneuver to a neurological spike of electricity down her spine. The physical contact was a reminder of his absolute dominance. Her breathing hitched as his touch reached her lower lip. Her third condition, however, was a jarring psychological pivot. She demanded premium wet food daily for her cat, Barnaby. A startlingly deep laugh erupted from the previously stoic syndicate boss. The sound of his genuine laughter was an extreme anomaly within the isolated walls of his penthouse. Before he could analyze this shift in his emotional baseline, the heavy steel elevator doors hissed open. His enforcer, Leo, strode in, his facial muscles locked in a mask of barely contained aggression. In his arms was Penelope's massive, 20-pound orange tabby cat. He bit one of the guards. Leo reported with a flat detachment, dropping the animal onto the plush rug. Penelope gasped and dropped to her knees. The cat immediately approached her, emitting a loud rhythmic big purr, aggressively rubbing its scent glands against her arm. She buried her face in its fur, desperately anchoring herself to this singular, grounding artifact of her previous non-violent life. The domestic illusion fractured instantly as Leo announced a critical situation. His eyes shifted away from the cat to lock onto the syndicate leader. The vulnerability vanished from Dominic's face, instantly replaced by the cold sociopathic stare required to maintain a criminal empire. When asked if they had acquired Sterling, Leo grimaced. The target had fled before the extraction team breached his residence. The secondary data point was far more alarming. They intercepted dark web communication confirming Sterling had copied the entire structural blueprint of Aegis Capital. Every legitimate holding, tax shelter, and offshore blind trust built over 5 years was now on a physical drive. Sterling was actively negotiating the sale of this critical data to Lorenzo Moretti. A profound, suffocating silence overtook the room. We must understand the catastrophic variables Penelope was processing in this exact moment. If the rival syndicate acquired Dominic Finance legitimate blueprints, it possessed the exact methodology to dismantle his clean businesses. They could trigger federal audits, freeze vital assets, and bleed the corporate structure dry within months, forcing the family back into the primitive, violent street wars they had evolved away from. Dominic Esser's vocal tone became lethally calm as he demanded the location of the exchange. Leo admitted their intelligence gap with obvious frustration. Sterling was using a highly encrypted Swiss escrow service to secure $15 million before relinquishing the drive. The transaction was pending. Once the funds cleared, the drop location would be transmitted. Penelope stood up, her silk sleepwear suddenly functioning as psychological armor. This is a fascinating behavioral shift. Her brilliant, hyper-analytical cognitive functions, suppressed for years by corporate abuse, engaged as a defense mechanism for her new apex predator. She questioned the use of the Swiss ghost account, stepping confidently between the two dangerous men. Leo insisted it was untraceable. Penelope countered that nothing is untraceable if one understands the underlying syntax. She clinically dissected Sterling's behavioral patterns, noting he was a creature of habit who reused cipher keys due to his own narcissistic arrogance. She immediately demanded the most powerful laptop Dominic possessed. The syndicate boss did not hesitate to enable. He directed her to a highly advanced black terminal resting on a glass desk. Penelope practically sprinted across the room, the orange feline trailing behind her as a Bazaar stabilizing bee presences. She dropped into the ergonomic chair, physically cracking her knuckles to relieve physiological tension. Her fingers moved with astonishing velocity, bypassing the standard operating system to open a root command terminal. The two violent men stood silently behind her, watching complex financial algorithms and green code reflect off her glasses. She muttered that her former employer, the firewall, was laughably inadequate, a vocalizer indicating a massive spike in self-esteem and a sudden lack of fear regarding her current surroundings. Let us examine how effortlessly she weaponized her knowledge, she revealed. She had installed a hidden backdoor in the server 3 years prior to enable remote access. She correctly hypothesized that the administrator protocols had never been updated. Within 3 minutes, her infiltration of the global banking node was absolute. She isolated the massive digital currency surge attempting to settle in the Swiss network. She identified the $15 million serving as the down payment to destroy Dominic's empire. When asked if she could halt the transfer, her face shifted into a wicked, triumphant smile. She informed him she could do far worse by rerouting the destination IP address directly to a flagged cartel shell company closely monitored by Interpol. By triggering automated anti-money laundering protocols, she ensured international authorities would permanently freeze the funds. She struck the enter key with definitive force. The system locked at 99%, displaying a glaring compliance hold. Leo observed with pure shock that she had just decimated the enemy's resources by $15 million without a single act of physical violence. Penelope swiveled her chair, clinically stating that Sterling was now stranded. Dominic stared down at his subject, his pupils dilated with dark obsession and profound awe. He placed his hand on her armrest, edging her against the desk. He leaned in to whisper that she was the most dangerous weapon in his entire syndicate, cementing her identity perfectly within his pathology. The following morning, a brilliant golden light penetrated the storm clouds over Manhattan. Penelope awoke in the massive guest quarters, experiencing a brief period of spatial disorientation caused by the absolute silence of the soundproof architecture. As she sat upright, pushing her tangled hair back, her brain processed her permanent transition into the criminal underworld. The lesson here is quite simple, Winter. When you stop shrinking to accommodate those who undervalue, you often find yourself embracing monsters who see your true worth. A sharp, authoritative knock startled her central nervous system. Pulling the heavy duvet up as a primitive shield, she called out. A sharp-eyed woman stepped inside with expensive garments, introducing herself formally as Clara. They told her she needed executive armor. For 2 hours, Penny was measured and pinned by Clara, an artist of reinvention. Penny was accustomed to off-the-rack suits that never fit garments designed to render her invisible, a classic defense mechanism. But when she finally faced the mirror, she gasped. She was encased in a bespoke midnight blue suit. The tailoring was mathematically perfect, cinching her waist while projecting absolute, terrifying authority. Her wild hair had been tamed into sleek waves. This was not just clothing. It was the physical manifestation of a psychological metamorphosis. Sometimes, the masks we wear do not just hide our vulnerabilities. They rewrite our identity entirely. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? She paired the suit with sharp black stilettos, looking less like a chief financial officer and more like a lethal weapon. When she entered the living area, Dominic waited by the glass elevator in a stark black suit and a blood-red silk tie. He froze as her heels clicked against the hardwood. His gaze meticulously tracked her sharp lines, resting on her flushed face. The raw hunger in his eyes was palpable, a classic exhibition of a megalomaniac narcissist admiring his own creation. It made Penny's breath catch a textbook autonomic fear response masquerading as desire. "You are breathtaking," he stated, allowing no room for dissuante. He offered his arm. "Ready as I will ever be," she replied, slipping her hand into his trap. The arrival at Aegis Capital headquarters was an orchestrated military operation designed entirely for psychological dominance. 3 armored vehicles pulled up to the glass-fronted skyscraper. When Dominic emerged, the busy parted instinctively. But when Penny stepped out behind him, flanked by heavily armed guards, the whispers began. They ascended to the 60th floor executive war room. Dominic pushed the doors open without knocking. Inside, 20 of the highest paid, most arrogant financial executives in New York sat around a massive mahogany table. These were men who treated the syndicate's money as their playground. At the head sat Gregory Trent, the vice president of acquisitions. Power, you see, is merely an illusion we agree to believe. Trent was a smug individual who had openly mocked Penny months ago over a routine compliance document. The room fell utterly silent the moment Dominic breached the threshold. "Good morning," Dominic said, his tone clinically devoid of warmth. He strode to the head of the table, forcing Trent to hastily vacate his seat. But Dominic did not sit. Instead, he pulled the heavy leather chair out and gestured for Penny. She inhaled deeply, channeled the artificial confidence of her midnight blue armor, and took the seat of power. Dominic stood directly behind her, placing his large hands firmly on her shoulders, while yet it was a calculated territorial claim. He was not supporting her. He was physically branding her as his property before the entire pack. It was an unmistakable assertion of absolute control. "Gentlemen," Dominic addressed the silent room. "As of this morning, Aegis Capital has restructured. Penelope Hayes is your new chief financial officer."
A directive from her is a directive from me. He offered them the door if they objected. Nobody breathed. Gregory Trent, however,
lacked the impulse control to mask his disdain. His lip curled as looked her over. Mr. Trent, arguing Miss Hayes is a junior auditor from a disgraced firm. We need a seasoned veteran at the helm, not a diversity hire. Trent's fragile ego blinded at him to deter in the room. Arrogance is often the loudest symptom of profound insecurity, and in this environment it was a fatal miscalculation. The atmosphere instantly turned toxic. Leo, standing by the door, flashed a predatory grin, anticipating the inevitable violence. Penny felt Dominic's fingers tighten on her shoulders, a coiled spring ready to strike. But then she reached up and gently touched his hand. "Let me handle this," she murmured. "This is a fascinating pivot. The hostage is now defending the captor's empire." Penny connected her tablet to the massive projector screen. "Mr. Trent," she said, her voice echoing with eerie calm. "Since you value seasoned veterans, let us review your recent portfolio, specifically the real estate acquisitions over the last 3 quarters. A detailed spreadsheet illuminated the wall, and Trent's smug facade immediately began to crumble. "You and I have probably both made the mistake of underestimating someone quiet." Trent certainly did. "You approved the purchase of 6 commercial warehouses in New Jersey for $40 million. Penny continued, swiping across the tablet to magnify the data. On paper, it was a solid investment, but the tax assessments were artificially inflated. You utilized a shell company called Apex Holdings to execute the appraisal." Trent went pale, stammering that it was standard procedure. "Apex Holdings," Penny interrupted, her voice cracking like a whip, "is registered in Delaware to your brother-in-law. You overpaid by $12 million, routing the surplus into an offshore account." Gasps rippled through the suffocating air of the boardroom. The executives physically recoiled from Trent, isolating the infected host. Penny stood up, bracing her hands on the mahogany table. She leaned forward, mimicking the body language of an apex predator. "You have not been managing his money, Gregory. You have been stealing it for 8 months. You skimmed $12 million from the most dangerous family in New York, using a depreciation scheme a first-year student could uncover." Trent began sweating profusely, his eyes darting to Dominic in sheer panic. He swore it was a mistake, claiming she manipulated the data. Dominic did not raise his voice. He simply said Leo's name. The enforcer stepped forward, hauling the terrified executive out of his chair by his tailored collar.
"Let us go, Greg." Leo mocked. "We are going to take a little ride to see what 12 million buys these days," Trent screamed,
clawing uselessly at the doorframe as the guards dragged him down the hall. His cries faded into a chilling silence. Penny sat back down and completely unfazed. She looked at the remaining 19 men, who now stared at her with a potent mixture of absolute terror and sudden reverence. "Now," Penny said calmly, folding her hands, "let us discuss the new compliance protocols." Behind her, Dominic leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Remind me never to lie to you on my taxes," he murmured. The trauma bond was cementing. When violence becomes your shield, you inevitably start to fall in love with the sword. Before Penny could process the intimate threat of his whisper, Dominic's private cell phone vibrated. The proud, possessive smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by an icy, lethal detachment. "Meeting adjourned," Dominic ordered. The executives practically trampled each other to escape the room. Once they were alone, Dominic explained that a bank freeze had forced a trace to Sterling's original network address. His technicians had found the ping. "Where is he?" Penny asked. "Teterboro Airport at a private hangar," Dominic replied, checking the pistols concealed in his waistband. The facade of corporate legitimacy was gone. We are reminded that beneath the polished veneer of civilization, the beast always remains awake. Stick with me, this is where the psychological profile gets truly fascinating. He's trying to chart a flight out of the country with the hard drive, Dominic stated, turning toward the door. He ordered Penny to stay behind and lock down the floor. The corporate boardroom was one environment, but atomic shoe-touter was an uncontrolled variable. No, Penny countered, stepping out from behind the safety of the table. He has the drive with the structural codes. I am the only one who knows how to wipe it remotely. I go where you go. That was the deal. Dominic stared at her. The dark, twisted romance of their collision was violently merging with the brutal reality of his criminal world. She was no longer a victim. She was a willing accomplice. He did not argue. He simply held out his hand. Penny took it, stepping willingly into the abyss. The drive to the airport was a chaotic blur of flashing highway lights and a tense, suffocating silence. 3 armored vehicles tore through the Lincoln Tunnel, pushing well past 80 miles per hour. In the back seat, Penny balanced her laptop on her knees, her fingers moving in a frantic rhythm. Roland is sloppy, but he is not entirely stupid, she analyzed, her eyes locked on the glowing screen. He will not connect to a public network. To trigger the remote kill switch I embedded, I need his laptop to ping a local network just once. In moments of extreme crisis, the human brain hyper-focuses on the task, effectively numbing the terror. Dominic checked the magazine of his customized pistol, slamming it home with a sharp metallic clack. "You will stay in the vehicle, Penelope," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Leo and I will secure the hangar. You wipe the drive the second you have a signal." Understood, she breathed, the suffocating reality of impending violence settling heavily in her chest. They breached the perimeter of the private aviation sector at exactly 11:42 in the morning. Hangar 4B was a massive corrugated steel structure. A sleek private jet was idling outside, its engines emitting a deafening whine. But Dominic's convoy was not the first to arrive. Parked recklessly near the plane were 2 black luxury vehicles. The board was set. The doors of the vehicles were wide open. Moretti's man, Leo, growled from the front seat, immediately drawing his weapon. Lorenzo must have figured out the escrow failed and came to take the drive by force. "Hit them," Dominic ordered without a hesitation. The armored vehicles did not slow down. They smashed through the chain-link security gate and skidding to a violent halt right at the hangar doors. Before the cars and even stopped, Dominic and his soldiers were out, using the reinforced doors for cover. Gunfire erupted instantly. The sharp cracks of suppressed automatic weapons echoed across the tarmac. Inside the vehicle, Penny ducked low, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every choice she had made had led her exactly to this terrifying moment. Today, we open the case file on Penelope, a fascinating study in criminal psychology and trauma bonding. She forced her eyes back to the glowing monitor, a desperate attempt to regulate her own nervous system. "Focus on the numbers," she told herself. She initiated a local network scan, hunting for Bluetooth or wireless signals within a 300-foot radius. Outside the vehicle, the subject, Dominic Rossi, moved with terrifying, lethal precision. He was not merely a corporate executive. He was a megalomaniac functioning as the apex predator of the New York underworld. With zero hesitation, he executed 2 cartel enforcers, delivering precise double pattes to their chests. Through the glass, she observed Roland Sterling, cornered against fuel drums, clutching a briefcase. Standing directly over the terrified executive was Vincent Russo, a highly violent operative for the Moretti Syndicate. A firearm was pressed firmly against Roland's temple. "Hand over the drive." Sterling Vincent roared, the sound barely piercing the auditory exclusion caused by the gunfire. "You failed to deliver the files, so we are taking them." The payment bounced. Roland shrieked, his silver hair disheveled, his nervous system entirely flooded with cortisol as he demanded his $15 million. Inside the armored vehicle, Penelope gasped. In his blind panic, Roland had opened his laptop to verify the data, to inadvertently connecting to the aircraft's local network. Her fingers began to fly across the keyboard, entering a state of absolute physiological hyperarousal. She initiated the override protocol, desperate to secure her utility to the man she was rapidly bonding with. A progress bar materialized on her screen, wiping the master directory. 12%, 34%. Inside the hangar, Vincent's impulse control completely shattered. He struck Roland violently across the jaw with his weapon. The silver case hit the concrete, spilling the encrypted hard drive. Vincent grasped the device with bloody fingers. "I have it. Fall back to the plane," he yelled to his subordinates. 67%, 85%. "Come on," Penelope chanted, her clinical fixation absolute. Vincent turned to flee, but his path was suddenly obstructed. Dominic emerged from behind a steel beam, his weapon leveled perfectly at Vincent's face. "Today, you and I are going to unpack this behavioral dynamic together, because what happens next is crucial." The surrounding gunfire abruptly ceased as Dominic's operatives completely outflanked the opposing men. "Put it down, Vincent," Dominic commanded, his vocal tone exhibiting the flat, dark affect of a true sociopath. Vincent sneered, elevating the hard drive like a protective shield. "You are too late, Rossi. I have the blueprint to your whole life right here, and Lorenzo is going to dismantle you." Inside the vehicle, Penelope's screen flashed a brilliant green. The wipe was complete. The directory was corrupted, the hardware entirely destroyed. She struck the armored glass, signaling a thumbs up to an operative named Leo, who instantly relayed the data to Dominic. A slow, devastating expression of amusement spread across Dominic's face, a classic display of narcissistic omnipotence. "Are you entirely sure about that, Vincent?" he asked with chilling softness. Vincent looked down. The small indicator light, previously a steady blue, suddenly blinked red, sparked, and went entirely dark. The drive was completely fried, reduced to a useless fragment of plastic and metal. Vincent's eyes widened in profound horror as his cognitive dissonance shattered. His advantage was gone. "Tell Lorenzo," Dominic stated, his tone dropping to an absolute freezing register, that his audit failed. Dominic fired a sing time. Vincent dropped to the concrete, instantly terminated. The surviving diving men dropped their weapons and surrendered immediately to Leo's crew. Roland Sterling, clutching his heavily bleeding jaw, looked up from the stained concrete. He processed the ruined drive, the deceased enforcer, and the terrifying reality of Dominic slowly advancing toward him. "Dom, please," Roland begged, scrambling backward until he collided with the fuel drums. "I was forced. They threatened my family. You know I am loyal." Dominic paused, analyzing the man who had attempted to betray him. "You are not loyal, Roland, and you certainly are not intelligent." Dominic barely shifted his gaze. "Leo, put him in the soundproof trunk. He will spend the rest of his extremely short life explaining exactly how many outcomes he compromised." Dominic holstered his weapon, completely devoid of empathy, and turned his back on the psychological wreckage. "You and I must look closely at this critical moment of psychological capture." Dominic walked directly to the armored vehicle and opened the heavy door. Penelope was sitting there, her physiological response peaking, hands shaking so violently she had to form fists. Yes. Dominic offered no verbal reassurance. He simply extracted her from the vehicle and enveloped her in his arms, burying his face in her dark hair. The potent scent of gunpowder and rain clung to his suit. But Penelope did not care. She wrapped her arms around his waist, anchoring herself to the most dangerous man on earth. This is the exact moment the Stockholm Syndrome truly took root. The storm had fully passed by the time they returned to the Tribeca estate, the Manhattan skyline glowing through the penthouse windows somehow. Penelope stood rigidly by the architectural glass, surveying the city below. She had replaced her ruined blazer with an oversized cashmere sweater, unconsciously seeking tactile comfort, though she retained her tailored trousers. A feline companion named Barnaby was curled around her ankles, blissfully ignorant of the organized crime violence that had just concluded. She registered the soft tread of footsteps behind her. Dominic stepped into the fading light, holding 2 glasses of 25-year-old scotch. He had showered, changing into dark, casual attire, presenting an image of physical dominance that easily overwhelmed her psychological defenses. Sterling is secure, Dominic reported quietly. The rival syndicate has retreated to Chicago for the time being. They lost $15 million, their most effective captain, and their only operational advantage. They will not challenge untouchable. We are completely untouchable. Penelope stared at the amber liquid in her crystal glass, her mind desperately seeking order. And the legitimate acquisitions, she asked. The Meridian deal is dead, Dominic replied clinically. But with the capital we preserved, we can purchase and shred 3 independent shipping conglomerates on the West Coast. Clean companies, no cartel ties. You will draft the proposals. Penelope finally turned to face her captor. Dominic, why did you trust me? I walked into your boardroom yesterday as a complete stranger. You let me restructure your entire empire. You brought me into a lethal firefight. Dominic stepped closer. He removed the crystal glass from her trembling hand and placed it onto a nearby marble surface. He reached out, his large hands framing her face, executing a textbook manipulative gesture designed to simulate profound intimacy. Because my entire life I have been surrounded by individuals who only see the monster, Dominic whispered. His dark eyes were entirely stripped of their usual defense armor. They see the violence, they see the money, they fear me, or they attempt to steal from me. But you stormed into a room of armed killers not to take anything, but to save me. You identified the trap when no one else did. Penelope's respiratory rate hitched as his gaze locked onto her lips. I was merely doing my job, she rationalized. You were doing what you were born to do. You and I have probably both witnessed this type of emotional conditioning. He leaned in, isolating her from her own reality. You have spent your entire life making yourself small so that mediocre men like Roland Sterling could feel big, he told her. I will never let you be invisible again. You are brilliant, ruthless, and the most beautiful woman I have ever observed. Tears formed in Penelope's eyes, driven not by fear, but by a profound, overwhelming psychological validation. She had spent a lifetime fighting her own body and intelligence, trying to fit into normal society. Dominic did not just accept her trauma, he weaponized it into worship. I belong to you, she whispered. It was the ultimate manifestation of trauma bonding. Dominic's eyes flared with possessive heat. And I belong to you, the light and the dark, replied, repulsed, permanently sighing the odd pathological connection. You will run the empire, and I will slaughter anyone who attempts to take it from you. It consumed her entirely. The physical escalation was fierce and and utterly consuming. Penelope tangled her fingers into his dark hair, matching his desperate psychological hunger with her own deep need for control. Pressed backward against the reinforced structural glass, his massive grain frame shielding us from the external world, cementing a bond forged in blood and billion-induced neote. 6 months later, the environment shifted to a pristine corporate boardroom. The long marble table was surrounded by 30 aggressively brilliant financial minds. There was no nepotism, no low-seasoned veterans from the old guard present. This was Pinot's newly constructed army, an echo chamber for her developing pathology. She stood at the head of the table, armored in a bespoke emerald green suit. She tapped her pen against a researched dossier. "The acquisition is completely unfudged," Penelope announced, her voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority. "The assets are clean. The tax shelters are legally ironclad. Our firm is now the largest legitimate logistics entity in the Western Hemisphere." Applause eyes erupted across the room. Stick with me, because here is the final life lesson. The most unbreakable prisons are the ones we willingly build for ourselves. She had fully integrated into the pathology of her captor, feeling entirely free. Let us examine the final tableau of this KSI file. Dominic Rossisset is in the seat of power, completely indifferent to the spreadsheets and sycophantic applause. His obsidian eyes fixated entirely on his chief financial officer. When his hand gripped her thigh beneath the table, it was the silent assertion of a textbook megalomaniac. Penelope merely offered a wicked smirk before returning to the Aegis capital empire. We are observing a profound psychological musician here. The overworked accountant mirrored the pathology of her captor, becoming the apex predator. If you find these dark studies of dominance fascinating, you know what to do. The lesson is simple. The environment designed to break you can sometimes teach you how to rule. Before we close this file, take a second to hit that like button. I want to hear your personal read on this case, so drop a comment below. What was the defining moment for you? Was it Penelope S. Sudden?
Violent break from reality when she smashed the guard's nose, or Dominic S. cold, calculated destruction of Roland Sterling? Share this breakdown with anyone else who is fascinated by the dark,
tangled web of enemies turning into lovers. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next case study of the criminal mind. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this one simple thought. No matter how unpredictable or dangerous your own circumstances get, keeping a calm, observant mind will always be your absolute best defense. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is that true courage, often when a person chooses to speak up, even when staying silent would be safer. Penelope Hayes is not introduced as a powerful executive, a wealthy leader, or someone protected by status. She is a junior forensic accountant who is often ignored, underestimated, and treated as invisible. Yet, when she discovers that the Meridian Logistics deal is a trap, she refuses to remain silent. She understands that warning Dominic Rossi could cost her job, her safety, and possibly her life. However, she also understands that silence would make her a participant in an injustice. This teaches an important educational lesson. Moral courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. In schools, workplaces, and communities, people often witness dishonesty, bullying, corruption, or unfair treatment. Many choose silence because speaking up may bring criticism or consequences. Penelope S. actions show that one honest voice can prevent disaster.
Her courage also proves that authority figures are not always right. Roland Sterling, her boss, has more power and status, but he is morally weak. Penelope has less power,
but she has truth on her side. The story encourages viewers to value integrity over comfort. It reminds us doing the right thing may feel dangerous in the moment, but it can change lives and expose hidden wrongdoing. Educationally, this message is especially meaningful for young people and workers who feel powerless. It teaches that even an ordinary person make an extraordinary difference when they choose truth over fear.